Every man deserves dignity, but Frank Delaney had forgotten what that felt like. 9 years of sleeping in shelters had worn him down to nothing, invisible to a world that stepped around him like he wasn't there. Then a lawyer found him with impossible news. He'd inherited a mansion from a great-uncle he never knew existed. The people of Millbrook laughed when they saw the homeless man moving into the crumbling estate. They watched him sweep debris and patch windows, shaking their heads at what looked like a man playing house. But Frank kept working, treating the old mansion like it mattered. What he found beneath the library floorboards would shock them all. What happens when the man everyone forgot discovers something worth $200 million? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Delaney sat on the courthouse steps, clutching the manila envelope like it might dissolve. Attorney James Morrison had disappeared into his BMW 20 minutes ago, leaving Frank with keys, a deed, and the lingering scent of expensive cologne that made him aware of his unwashed state. The inheritance made no sense. Great-uncle Cornelius Ashford Frank had never heard the name. His mother had been a Delaney through and through, never mentioned any Ashfords. But the paperwork was legitimate. DNA tests had been run after Cornelius died 6 months ago. Frank was the sole heir to the Ashford estate in Millbrook, Massachusetts. Frank fingered the dog tags hidden beneath his threadbare jacket. Staff Sergeant Francis Michael Delaney, U.S. Army. Once those tags had meant something: discipline, purpose, a place in the world. Before Sarah died of cancer, before the drinking started, before the night terrors got so bad he couldn't hold down a job, before he'd lost everything and found himself on Boston streets. The bus ride to Millbrook cost his last $12. He'd spent 9 years learning to make himself invisible. But as the bus pulled into the small New England town, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years: curiosity. Millbrook looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. White church steeples, brick storefronts, maple trees lining Main Street. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors. Names and left doors unlocked. The mansion sat behind wrought iron gates that hung askew on rusted hinges. Frank stopped and stared. The Ashford estate was massive, 3 stories of Victorian Gothic architecture with turrets, bay windows, and intricate stonework. Paint peeled from every surface, shutters hung at odd angles, and weeds claimed the circular driveway. A crowd had gathered across the street. Frank recognized the look, part curiosity, part judgment, all superiority. "That's him," someone whispered. "The homeless man who thinks he owns the Ashford place." Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. The keys worked. The front door opened with a groan that echoed through what had once been a grand foyer. Dust motes danced in sunlight streaming through broken windows. A crystal chandelier hung crooked, casting fractured rainbows on water-stained wallpaper. The silence was profound. Frank had grown accustomed to shelter noise, snoring, crying, arguments. Here, he could hear his heartbeat. It was unsettling, and somehow peaceful. He explored methodically, the way he'd once cleared buildings in training. A dining room with a table that could seat 20. A music room with a yellowed grand piano. A conservatory where exotic plants had withered, leaving only clay pots and garden ghosts. The kitchen was enormous, with a cast-iron stove that belonged in a restaurant. Copper pots hung from hooks, green with verdigris. The pantry was the size of his last apartment, if he'd had an apartment, but it was the library that stopped him cold. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked older than the country. A massive desk dominated the center, covered with papers, ink bottles, and correspondence dating back decades. Above the fireplace hung a portrait of a stern man with Frank's gray eyes and stubborn jawline. Cornelius Ashford, presumably. Frank's great-uncle, the stranger who'd left him a palace he didn't deserve. Voices outside drew him to the window. The crowd had grown larger, pointing and talking. Disgrace to the neighborhood property values. Someone should call the authorities. Frank stepped back. He'd been here less than an hour, and already they wanted him gone. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been living rough too long. But standing in that library, surrounded by accumulated wisdom, Frank felt something stir. Not hope. He'd given up on hope. But determination, maybe. Or stubbornness. Thought the house needed work, but it had good bones. Frank had learned things in the army more during the lean years that followed. He knew how to fix things, make something work when it seemed beyond repair. He'd spent 9 years being told he was worthless. Maybe it was time to find out if that was true. A woman with styled gray hair stepped forward when Frank ventured onto the porch. "I'm Patricia Richardson, mayor of Millbrook. There seems to be confusion about ownership of this property." Frank nodded. "Frank Delaney. I inherited it." "Well, yes, but surely you understand our concerns. This property has been vacant for months. The neighborhood has standards. I understand. I'll be fixing it up. With what money?" The question came from a red-faced man in an expensive golf shirt. "You don't exactly look like you have resources for a restoration of this magnitude." Frank didn't answer. He'd learned that silence often said more than words. A younger woman approached from across the street, carrying a canvas bag. She had kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back practically. Unlike the others, she didn't look at Frank like something unpleasant had washed ashore. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. "I run the town library. I brought supplies, soap, towels, sandwiches. Figured you might need them." Frank accepted the bag, surprised. "Thank you." Cornelius was a good man. Sarah continued, ignoring disapproving looks. Eccentric, maybe, but decent. He came to the library every week, always researching something. Art history, mostly. Said he was working on a project. "Sarah," Mayor Richardson interrupted. "Perhaps this isn't appropriate." "It's exactly appropriate. This man has as much right to be here as anyone. More, actually, since it's his property." The crowd dispersed, muttering. Mayor Richardson lingered, but eventually walked away. Soon it was just Frank and Sarah in the overgrown garden. "They'll come around," Sarah said. "Give them time." Frank studied her face, looking for the catch. In his experience, kindness always came with a price. But Sarah's expression remained open, genuine. "Why?" he asked. "Why what? Why help me?" "You don't know me." Sarah smiled. "Cornelius left you this place for a reason. Maybe I'd like to find out what that reason was." As she walked away, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of hope. Maybe that was enough to start with. The mansion felt different when he went back inside. Still overwhelming, still beyond anything he'd imagined owning. But now it felt less like a mistake and more like a challenge. Frank had faced challenges before. He'd survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, survived losing Sarah, survived 9 years on the streets. He could survive inheriting a mansion, too. The first night was hardest. Frank spread his sleeping bag on the library floor, using his duffel as a pillow. Every sound seemed amplified, the house settling, wind rattling windows, distant traffic hum. But gradually, the silence became less oppressive and more peaceful. For the first time in years, Frank fell asleep without listening for footsteps or checking his belongings. When he woke, sunlight streamed through library windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in golden air. Frank lay still, taking in his surroundings. Cornelius Ashford's portrait gazed down from above the fireplace. Those familiar gray eyes holding secrets. Frank was only beginning to guess at Dot there was work to do. More work than one man could handle, probably. But Frank had learned to take things one day at a time. That was how you survived when everything else fell apart. He started with basics, clearing debris, boarding broken windows, making supply lists. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that day labor never had. This wasn't about earning enough money to eat. This was about building something, creating something worth having done by noon. Trash had accumulated on the front lawn. Frank was wrestling with rotted wood when a pickup truck pulled up. An elderly man climbed out, moving with careful precision. "You're the Delaney boy," the man said. Frank straightened. "Frank Delaney. Pete Kowalski. I run the hardware store. Knew your great uncle. Good man, though folks thought he was touched. Touched how?" Pete shrugged. "Always researching, asking questions about the old days, during the war and such. Kept to himself mostly, but polite when he came into the store." Frank waited. People usually had more to say if given space. "I heard you were fixing the place up. Figured you might need supplies." "I don't have much money." "Didn't ask about money. Cornelius had an account with me. Never closed it out. Figure his heir ought to use it." Frank felt that unfamiliar stirring again. Not hope, but something in that neighborhood. "I appreciate that." They spent an hour walking through the mansion, Pete pointing out structural issues and solutions. The older man knew his business. He also knew how to work within a budget, suggesting repairs that would be effective without being expensive. "You got skills," Pete observed, watching Frank examine water damage. "Military? Army. Some construction after I got out. Before things went sideways?" Frank glanced at him sharply, but Pete's expression held no judgment, only understanding. We all got our stories," Pete said quietly. "Question is what you do with the next chapter." As they walked back toward the front door, Pete paused in the library. "Cornelius spent lots of time in here. Always said this room held secrets, but I figured he was being dramatic. Old men get that way." Frank looked around with new eyes. The library was in better condition than the rest of the house. The books were dusty but undamaged. The furniture solid if neglected. It felt like a sanctuary. What kind of secrets? Frank asked. Pete shrugged. Never said exactly. But he was always measuring things, checking walls, looking at old blueprints. Acted like he was searching for something. After Pete left, promising supplies the next morning, Frank found himself drawn back to the library. He walked the perimeter slowly, running hands along walls, checking for irregularities. The room was large, maybe 30 feet square, with the desk positioned to take advantage of natural light. Behind the desk, he discovered a small door he'd missed. It opened onto narrow stairs, leading to what must have been servants' quarters. The rooms were small, but well-proportioned, in better condition than much of the main house. Frank could live up here while working on the rest. But returning to the library, he made his first real discovery. Moving books to dust shelves, Frank found something tucked behind a large volume on Renaissance art. A small leather journal, pages, yellow with age and brittle. The handwriting was spidery but legible, ink faded to brown. On the first page, property of Cornelius Ashford, private reflections and observations. 1943 to 1944. Frank settled into the leather chair and began reading. The entries started normally: weather observations, household repairs, war progress comments. But as months progressed, the tone became more urgent, secretive. The shipment arrived today. Smaller than expected, but better condition. M was right about the cellar climate, dry and stable. Perfect for preservation. Had to send Annie away. Too dangerous for her to know. Fewer people involved, the better. What we're doing could get us killed if wrong people find out. The network is compromised. 3 safe houses discovered this month. We may be the last link. Everything depends on keeping the collection secure until war ends. Frank read late into the night. the journal's mysteries deepening with each entry. Cornelius had been involved in something significant during World War II, something secret and dangerous. The final entry was dated December 15th, 1944. The war may end soon, but our work isn't finished. What we've preserved must remain hidden until the world is ready. I've made arrangements, sealed the chamber, hidden the entrance, left clues for those who might come after. The family must know someday, but not yet. Not while danger remains. Frank closed the journal, mind racing. Hidden chamber, sealed entrance. Left clues for those who might come after. The family must know. He looked up at Cornelius's portrait, those gray eyes that mirrored his own. His great-uncle hadn't just left him a house. He'd left him a mystery, a responsibility that had waited. 70 years for the right person to claim it. Frank Delaney had spent 9 years believing he was worth nothing. But sitting in that library, holding his great-uncle's secrets, he began to wonder if maybe he'd been wrong. Frank woke before dawn. Cornelius' journal clutched against his chest. He'd fallen asleep reading and rereading the entries, trying to piece together the puzzle his great-uncle had left behind. The phrases haunted him: sealed the chamber, hidden the entrance, the collection. The morning light revealed details he'd missed in his initial exploration. Now, armed with his great-uncle's cryptic references, Frank began to see the library differently. The desk was positioned oddly, not centered, but pushed toward one wall. The pattern of wear on the oriental rug suggested furniture had been moved repeatedly. And there, barely visible unless you knew to look, were scratches on the hardwood floor marks, made by something heavy being dragged. Frank spent the morning clearing debris from other rooms, but his mind kept returning to the library. When Sarah arrived around noon with supplies and coffee, she found him measuring walls with Pete's carpenter's tape. "Doing some remodeling?" she asked, settling into a leather chair. Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. "Something like that. Tell me about Cornelius. What was he like?" Sarah considered carefully. Intelligent. Obsessed with history, particularly World War II. He'd spend hours researching, always asking me to order books on specific topics. Art history, museum cataloging, techniques for preserving documents and paintings. Did he ever mention hiding anything or finding anything? Not directly, but there were times when he'd get excited about something he'd discovered. He'd hinted having found proof of something important, something that would set the record straight, as he put it. I always assumed he was working on some kind of book. Frank showed her the journal. Sarah read through several entries, her eyes widening as the implications became clear. "My God," she whispered. "He was part of the resistance movement, wasn't he? One of the networks that helped save art from the Nazis. That's what it sounds like. But where did he hide everything? And what happened to it?" They spent the afternoon searching systematically. Sarah proved methodical, approaching the mystery like a research project. She examined books while Frank focused on architectural details. By evening, they'd found several interesting anomalies, but nothing resembling a hidden entrance. It was Sarah who made the first breakthrough. She was reshelving books when she noticed something odd about one section of the built-in bookcases. "Frank, look at this." She ran her fingers along the shelf edge. "This section doesn't line up with the others. The depth is different by maybe 3 inches. Frank examined the area. Sarah was right. The discrepancy was subtle, but once noticed, obvious. The bookshelf was shallower than it should be, as if something had been built behind it. "Help me move these books," Frank said. They cleared the shelves methodically, stacking volumes on Cornelius's desk. With the books gone, the construction became apparent. The back panel was clearly newer than surrounding woodwork, installed after the mansion's original construction. Frank ran his hands along the edges, looking for hinges or ledges. Nothing. But when he pressed against the center, it gave slightly, as if not solidly attached to the wall behind. "There's definitely space back there," he said, "but I can't figure out how to access it." They were still puzzling over the mechanism when voices outside interrupted them. Frank peered through the window to see Mayor Richardson approaching with two men in expensive suits. Their body language suggested this wasn't a social call. "Mr. Delaney," Mayor Richardson called from the porch. "Could we have a word?" Frank and Sarah exchanged glances. They'd been so absorbed they'd lost track of time. It was nearly 8 o'clock, summer light beginning to fade. The mayor introduced her companions as Boston developers, representatives of a company interested in acquiring the Ashford property. They were polite but persistent, making it clear they viewed Frank's presence as an obstacle. "We understand your attachment to the property," the older developer said smoothly. "But surely, you can see that maintaining a mansion of this size would be financially impossible for someone in your ... circumstances." Frank bristled, but kept his voice level. "The property isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price," the second developer replied. "We're prepared to make a generous offer. Enough to set you up comfortably somewhere more ... appropriate." "I said it's not for sale." The tension was palpable. Mayor Richardson wanted to avoid confrontation, but the developers seemed prepared to apply more pressure. "Mr. Delaney," the older man said, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. This property has been vacant for months. The neighborhood is concerned about property values, public safety. There are zoning issues, tax considerations. The city has ways of encouraging property owners to make responsible decisions." It was a threat, barely veiled but unmistakable. Frank felt his military training kick in, assess the enemy, identify objectives, plan response. These men saw him as weak, vulnerable, easy to intimidate. They were wrong. "Gentlemen," Frank said quietly, "I think this conversation is over." After they left, Sarah helped Frank replace the books they'd removed. The interruption had broken their concentration, but it had also crystallized something for Frank. These people wanted him gone, wanted the mansion torn down or converted for profit. They saw the property as just another development opportunity, but Frank was beginning to understand that the mansion was something more than real estate. It was a repository of history, a keeper of secrets that had waited 70 years for someone to uncover them. His great-uncle had trusted him with this responsibility, had somehow known that Frank would be the one to carry it forward. That night, unable to sleep, Frank found himself back in the library, studying Cornelius's journal by lamplight. He read the entries again, paying closer attention to details, looking for clues he might have missed. One passage caught his attention. "The compass points true north, but truth is sometimes found in unexpected directions. The wise man looks not where others expect, but where logic and necessity converge." Frank had assumed this was philosophical rambling, but now he wondered if it might be more literal. He'd noticed an antique compass on Cornelius's desk, a beautiful brass instrument that looked like it belonged in a ship's navigation room. Frank picked it up, surprised by its weight and craftsmanship. The compass needle pointed steadily north, just as Cornelius had written. But examining the instrument more closely, Frank discovered it was more than just a navigation tool. Engraved along the rim, in script so small it was barely visible, were coordinates 42 23 47 and 71 411 WFR, and K's pulse quickened. These weren't random numbers. They were precise geographical coordinates. But coordinates for what? And where? He spent the next hour trying to decipher the location, using his phone's GPS function to check the coordinates. They pointed to somewhere in Massachusetts, not far from Millbrook. But without better maps and equipment, he couldn't determine the exact location. It was nearly midnight when Frank made his second discovery. He was returning the compass to its position, with his elbow knocked over a small ink bottle. As he reached to write it, his hand brushed against something unexpected, a small lever hidden beneath the desk's edge, position where someone sitting would naturally rest their arm. Frank's heart hammered as he examined the mechanism. The lever was ingeniously concealed, designed to look like a decorative element. But when he pressed it, he heard a soft click from somewhere behind him. He turned to see that the suspicious bookshelf had moved, not much, just an inch or two, but enough to reveal it was indeed a hidden door. Frank's hands shook as he pulled. The panel fully open. Behind the bookshelf was a narrow corridor, maybe 4 feet wide, extending back into darkness. The air that emerged was cool and dry, carrying scents of old wood and something else, something that reminded Frank of museums and libraries, the smell of carefully preserved things. Frank grabbed a flashlight from his supplies and stepped into the corridor. The passage was longer than expected, extending perhaps 20 feet before ending at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The door was locked, but Frank could see the key was still in the mechanism Cornelius had left it ready for whoever would eventually follow. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal something Frank could never have imagined. The room beyond was a perfect climate-controlled environment, larger than the library above, and filled with treasures that took Frank's breath away. Paintings lined the walls, works that even his untrained eye recognized as masterpieces. Sculptures stood on pedestals throughout the space. Glass cases held documents, books, and artifacts that looked priceless. But it was the far wall that made Frank's knees weak. There, arranged with museum-quality care, were dozens of paintings that seemed to glow with inner light. Monet, Picasso, Van Gogh, names he recognized from limited art education. Each piece was labeled with a small placard providing details about provenance and historical significance. Frank sank into a chair positioned in the center of the room, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just a collection. It was a treasury of human culture, saved from destruction during the war and hidden away for 7 decades. A leather-bound ledger sat open on a nearby table. Frank opened it with trembling hands and found himself looking at Cornelius's meticulous records. Each item was cataloged with photographs, provenance documentation, and notes about acquisition. The monetary values listed next to each entry were staggering tens of millions of dollars, possibly more. But as Frank read through Cornelius's notes, he realized the financial value was secondary to historical importance. These weren't just valuable objects. They were pieces of human heritage that would have been lost forever if not for brave people who risked their lives to save them. The final entry in the ledger was dated just 6 months ago, shortly before Cornelius's death. The time has come to pass this responsibility to the next generation. My great-nephew Francis will inherit not just property, but a sacred trust. These treasures were saved by heroes who died to protect them. They must now be returned to the world, but only when the right person can ensure they receive the care and respect they deserve. Francis has suffered, as I once suffered. But suffering can teach compassion, and compassion can guide us toward justice. I trust him to make the right choice. Frank sat in the hidden chamber until dawn, surrounded by treasures beyond imagination, trying to process what his great-uncle had entrusted to him. This wasn't just about money, though the financial implications were staggering. This was about preserving history, honoring the memory of those who had died to save these works, and making decisions that would affect not just his own life, but the cultural heritage of the world. When he finally climbed back through the hidden passage into the library, Frank was no longer the same man who had inherited a crumbling mansion days ago. He was the guardian of something precious, the keeper of secrets that would change everything once revealed. The morning light streaming through the library windows seemed different now, charged with possibility and responsibility. Frank looked up at Cornelius's portrait and nodded, a gesture of acceptance and understanding. He knew what he had to do. The question was whether he had the courage to do it. Frank spent the morning pacing the mansion like a caged animal, his mind reeling. From the previous night's discovery, $200 million worth of art and artifacts sat hidden beneath his feet, and he had no idea what to do about it. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than anything he'd carried during his military service. He'd closed the hidden passage before dawn, ensuring everything appeared normal should anyone come calling. But normal was relative when you just discovered a treasure trove that could change your life, and potentially the lives of countless others forever. The sound of Sarah's car in the driveway brought him back to reality. She'd promised to bring research materials from the library, books about art recovery efforts during World War II. Frank met her at the door, trying to keep his expression neutral despite the chaos in his mind. "You look terrible," Sarah observed, setting down a box of books. "Didn't you sleep?" "Not much." Frank helped her carry materials into the library. "I kept thinking about what we discussed yesterday, about Cornelius and his war work." They spent the morning reading, and what they discovered only deepened the mystery. During World War II, a network of museums, collectors, and resistance fighters had worked to save art from Nazi looting and destruction. Many pieces had been hidden in remote locations, and some had never been recovered. The stories were heroic and heartbreaking, ordinary people risking their lives to preserve humanity's cultural heritage. "Look at this," Sarah said, showing Frank a photograph in one of the books. The monument's men allied soldiers tasked with protecting cultural treasures. They worked with local networks to hide art in caves, cellars, anywhere the Nazis couldn't find it. Frank studied the black and white photograph. The men looked determined but overwhelmed, facing an impossible task with inadequate resources. He wondered if Cornelius had worked with people like this, if the hidden chamber beneath the mansion had been part of their network. Around noon, Pete arrived with more supplies and an offer to help with restoration work. Frank was grateful for the distraction. Physical labor had always helped him think, and he needed time to process what he'd discovered. They started with structural issues, replacing rotted floorboards, fixing leaky windows, patching wall holes. Pete worked with the efficiency of a man who'd spent decades solving problems with his hands, while Frank found himself remembering skills from the Army and his brief construction career. "You've got good instincts," Pete observed, watching Frank repair crown molding. "Most people would have torn this out and replaced it with something modern. But you're taking time to preserve the original craftsmanship." Frank paused in his work. "Seems wrong to destroy something that's lasted this long just because it's easier." "That's the difference between restoration and renovation," Pete said. "Restoration respects what came before. Takes more time, costs more money, but the result is worth it." As they worked, Pete shared stories about Cornelius. The old man had been something of a local mystery, polite but distant, scholarly but secretive. He'd lived in the mansion alone for 40 years, rarely entertaining visitors but occasionally hosting what Pete described as scholarly types who would arrive with briefcases and leave with serious expressions. "Always thought he was writing a book," Pete said. "Had that look about him, you know? Like he was carrying around important information that he couldn't quite figure out how to share." Frank's hand stilled on the wood he was sanding. "What kind of important information?" "Hard to say. But during the World War II, this area was more connected to the action than most people realize. We had defense contractors, training, facilities, even some classified research happening at the university. A lot of people passing through who weren't supposed to be here officially." That afternoon, while Pete went to fetch more supplies, Frank found himself alone in the mansion with Sarah. She was organizing the books they borrowed, creating a research system that would help them understand the historical context of Cornelius's work. Frank watched her methodical approach with growing admiration. Sarah had intelligence and patience, qualities he'd learned to value during his years of struggle. She also had something else, an ability to see past surface appearances to the person underneath. She'd looked at him and seen potential when everyone else saw only a homeless man playing house in a mansion too grand for him. "Sarah," he said carefully, "what would you do if you found something valuable? Something that belonged to other people, but those people didn't know it existed?" She looked up from her cataloging. "Are we talking hypothetically?" "Maybe." Sarah considered the question seriously. "I suppose it would depend on what it was and how it came to be lost. But generally speaking, I think the right thing would be to find a way to return it to its rightful owners. Or at least make sure it was used in a way that honored its original purpose." Frank nodded, filing away her answer. Sarah's moral compass was clear and unwavering, exactly what he needed to help navigate the ethical complexities of his situation. Their research continued through the afternoon, and gradually a clearer picture emerged of the world Cornelius had inhabited during the war. The network that had saved cultural treasures had been vast and complex, involving everyone from museum curators to Catholic priests to ordinary citizens who risked everything to preserve humanity's heritage. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading from a memoir by one of the monument's men. "They estimate that millions of artworks and cultural artifacts were stolen or destroyed during the war. Some have been recovered, but many are still missing. Families are still searching for pieces that belonged to their ancestors." Frank felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him again. If the hidden chamber contained stolen art, then there were families who had legitimate claims to those pieces. People who had spent decades wondering what happened to their heritage. But there was another possibility, one that seemed more likely given Cornelius's careful documentation. What if the art in the chamber hadn't been stolen, but saved? What if Cornelius and his network had been the good guys, preserving treasures that would otherwise have been lost forever? The afternoon light was fading when they made their next significant discovery. Sarah was examining a book about Renaissance art when something fell from between its pages, a black and white photograph, creased with age but still clear enough to make out the details. The photo showed a group of men and women standing in what appeared to be the mansion's library, but the room looked different than it did now. The furniture was arranged differently, and there were wooden crates stacked against one wall. The people in the photo were dressed in 1940s clothing, their faces serious but determined. Frank recognized Cornelius immediately, though he was decades younger in the photograph. He stood in the center of the group, one hand resting on a wooden crate, the other holding what appeared to be a document or manifest. "Look at the back," Sarah said, turning the photograph over. In Cornelius's careful handwriting. "The Millbrook Network, December 1944. Final shipment secured. C.A. M.R. T.S. A.M. J.K. P.D. May history remember their courage." Frank studied the initials. C.A. was obviously Cornelius Ashford, but who were the others? And what had happened to them after the war ended? "We need to find out who these people were," Frank said. "If Cornelius was part of a network, there might be other families who know part of the story." Sarah nodded, already making notes. "I can research the local records, check genealogical databases. Some of these people might still have relatives in the area." As they worked, Frank found himself watching Sarah with growing appreciation. She approached each piece of evidence with scholarly precision, but there was compassion in her methodology too. She understood that they weren't just solving a historical puzzle. They were uncovering human stories that had been buried for 70 years. When Pete returned with the afternoon supply run, he found them surrounded by books, documents, and photocopies. Frank showed him the photograph, watching the older man's face carefully for any sign of recognition. Pete studied the image for a long moment, then pointed to one of the figures in the background. "That's my grandfather," he said quietly. "Peter Kowalski. PK, those would be his initials." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. "Your grandfather was part of Cornelius's network." "Makes sense now," Pete said, sinking into one of the library chairs. "After the war, he used to tell stories about special work he'd done during the conflict. Never gave details, said it was classified. My father always thought he was exaggerating, trying to make himself seem more important than he was." "What kind of special work?" Pete shook his head. "Transport, mostly. He had a trucking business, one of the few in the area with vehicles that could handle heavy loads over long distances. During the war, he got contracts with the government moving equipment, supplies, that sort of thing. But sometimes he'd hint about moving other things, valuable things that needed special care." Frank and Sarah exchanged glances. A trucking business would have been perfect for moving stolen art, providing both the means and the cover story necessary to transport valuable items without attracting attention. "Did your grandfather ever mention this place?" Sarah asked. "The Ashford Mansion?" "Not directly," Pete said. "But he used to drive by here sometimes when I was a kid. He'd slow down, look at the house with this expression, respectful, I guess, like he was remembering something important." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they raised as many questions as they answered. If Pete's grandfather had been part of the network, how many other local families had been involved? And what had happened to the knowledge they'd carried? Had it died with them, or were there other people in Millbrook who knew fragments of the story? As evening approached, Pete helped Frank secure the mansion for the night. They'd made good progress on the structural repairs, and the house was beginning to feel less like a ruin and more like a home. But Frank knew that the real work, figuring out what to do about the hidden treasure, was just beginning. After Pete and Sarah left, Frank returned to the library and opened the hidden passage once more. He needed to see the collection again, to convince himself that it was real and not just an elaborate dream brought on by stress and exhaustion. The treasures were exactly as he'd left them, glowing softly in the artificial light. Frank walked among the paintings and sculptures, trying to imagine the stories behind each piece. Who had owned them originally? How had they ended up in Cornelius's care? And what would happen to them now? In one corner of the chamber, Frank discovered something he'd missed during his initial exploration: a wall safe, its door standing open. Inside were documents that made his heart race: provenance records, transfer papers, correspondence with museums and collectors. Everything was meticulously organized, creating a paper trail that proved the legitimacy of Cornelius's collection. But it was the final document that made Frank's hands shake. A letter, dated just 3 months before Cornelius's death, addressed, "To my unknown heir." The letter explained everything. Cornelius had spent decades researching the rightful owners of the pieces in his collection. Some belonged to families who had been murdered during the Holocaust. Others had been saved from museums that were bombed or looted. A few had been gifts from grateful refugees who had no way to transport their treasures to safety. Cornelius had tried to return what he could, but many of the original owners were dead, their families scattered or destroyed. So he had made a different choice: to preserve the collection until someone with the right combination of integrity and need could take responsibility for its future. "I have watched you from afar," the letter continued, "and I know the struggles you have faced. A man who has lost everything understands the true value of what remains. I trust you to make the decisions I could not make, to find the courage I lacked, to ensure that these treasures serve their highest purpose." Frank folded the letter carefully and returned to the library above. He stood before Cornelius's portrait, seeing his great-uncle with new understanding. The old man hadn't just saved art, he'd saved responsibility, passing it on to someone he believed could handle it better than he had. The question now was whether Frank was worthy of that trust. He'd spent 9 years believing he was worthless, and he had nothing to offer the world. But maybe Cornelius had seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself, the potential for redemption, for making choices that mattered. Frank settled into the leather chair behind Cornelius's desk and began the plan. Tomorrow, he would start the process of determining what to do with the collection. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But for the first time in years, Frank had a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Frank was examining the antique compass when he heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, he saw a sleek black sedan, the kind of vehicle that usually meant official business. A woman in her 50s emerged from the car, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She approached the front door with purposeful strides, carrying a leather briefcase that suggested she was here on serious business. Frank opened the door before she could knock. "Can I help you, Mr. Delaney? I'm Dr. Helena Vasquez from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I understand you've recently inherited this property from Cornelius Ashford." Frank's pulse quickened. "That's correct. I wonder if we might speak privately. It's about some historical materials that your great-uncle may have been preserving." Frank invited her into the library, his mind racing through possibilities. How much did she know about Cornelius's collection? Was this official museum business or something else entirely? Dr. Vasquez examined the room with professional interest, noting the quality of the books, the portrait above the fireplace, the overall atmosphere of scholarly dedication. "Your great-uncle was a remarkable man," she said, settling into one of the leather chairs. "We corresponded for many years about various art historical matters. He had an extraordinary knowledge of pieces that went missing during World War II. Frank chose his words carefully. "I'm still learning about his interests. I didn't know him well." Dr. Vasquez nodded sympathetically. "That's understandable. Cornelius was very private about his work, but he mentioned you in our recent correspondence. Said he hoped you would continue his research into cultural preservation." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Delaney, I'm going to be direct with you. The Metropolitan has been working with various agencies to trace artwork that was stolen or displaced during the war. We have reason to believe that your great-uncle may have preserved some important pieces that rightfully belong to families or institutions." Frank felt sweat forming on his palms. "What makes you think that?" "Years of correspondence, careful analysis of his research interests, and reports from other collectors and museums about his expertise in provenance matters." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. "Mr. Delaney, if such pieces exist, we want to help ensure they're handled appropriately. The families who lost these treasures deserve to have them returned." Frank studied her face, trying to determine whether she was ally or threat. What would that process look like? Careful documentation, professional authentication, and coordination with appropriate authorities to ensure legal ownership issues are resolved properly. Dr. Vasquez pulled out business cards from several organizations. "We work with Holocaust restitution groups, genealogical researchers, and law enforcement agencies to make sure recovered artwork finds its way to the right hands." Frank examined the cards' legitimate organizations with impressive credentials. "And if I were to discover something, what would happen to it during this process?" "That would depend on the specific circumstances. Pieces with clear provenance would be returned to families or donated to appropriate institutions. Items without identifiable owners might be placed in museums where they could serve educational purposes." Dr. Vasquez's expression was earnest. "The goal is always to honor the original intent of the owners and to ensure these treasures are preserved for future generations." Frank felt a spark of hope. Maybe there was a way to handle Cornelius's collection that would satisfy both legal requirements and moral obligations. Dr. Vasquez, if I were to find materials that might be relevant to your research, how would we proceed? Very carefully, she replied. With full documentation, professional oversight, and complete transparency about the process. Mr. Delaney, what your great-uncle accomplished during the war was heroic. Our job now is to complete that work by ensuring the treasures he saved reach their proper destinations. After Dr. Vasquez left, promising to return if Frank discovered anything relevant, Frank found himself cautiously optimistic for the first time since discovering the hidden chamber. They were legitimate, professional people who understood the complexities of wartime art recovery and who had systems in place to handle exactly his situation. But Frank also realized that once he revealed the collection's existence, control would pass to others. Museum professionals, legal experts, government agencies, all with their own procedures and timelines. The decision about what to do with Cornelius's treasures would no longer be his alone. Sarah arrived that afternoon with more research materials and news from her investigation into the network members shown in the 1944 photograph. I found records for most of them, she reported, spreading documents across Cornelius's desk. Thomas Steinberg, he's still alive, living in a retirement community outside Boston. Mary Rodriguez died in 1987, but her daughter still lives in Springfield. James Morrison, that might be the lawyer who contacted you about the inheritance. Frank looked up sharply. The lawyer who found me was named James Morrison. Sarah nodded. Different generation, probably. The James Morrison in the photo would be over 100 now, but his son or grandson might have inherited knowledge about the network's activities. Frank thought about his initial meeting with attorney Morrison, trying to remember details that might have seemed insignificant at the time. The man had been very specific about DNA testing, very careful about establishing Frank's legitimate claim to the inheritance. Had that been normal legal caution or something more purposeful? Sarah, Frank said slowly, what if the inheritance wasn't random? What if I was specifically chosen to receive it? Sarah looked at him with growing understanding. You think the network is still active? I think the people who saved these treasures during the war might have spent the last 70 years making sure they would eventually reach the right hands. Frank pulled out the compass, showing Sarah the coordinates engraved on its rim. Cornelius left clues everywhere. This compass, the hidden mechanism in the desk, the coded references in his journal. It's like he was preparing for someone to follow in his footsteps. Sarah studied the compass coordinates. Have you checked what's at this location? Frank shook his head. I was afraid to investigate too much before I understood what I was dealing with. Maybe it's time to find out, Sarah said. If there's more to this network than we realize, those coordinates might lead us to answers about what Cornelius really wanted you to do. Frank felt the familiar weight of decision pressing down on him. Every choice he made seemed to lead to more complexity, more responsibility, more ways he could potentially fail the trust Cornelius had placed in him. But he was beginning to understand that avoiding decisions was itself a choice, and probably the worst one he could make. Cornelius had preserved these treasures for 7 decades, waiting for someone who would have the courage to act. Frank could honor that patience with action, or dishonor it with hesitation. All right, Frank said. Tomorrow we follow those coordinates and see what Cornelius wanted us to find. As evening settled over Millbrook, Frank stood in the library surrounded by evidence of a mission that had begun during World War II and was now, somehow, becoming his responsibility to complete. The weight was enormous, but for the first time, since discovering the hidden chamber, Frank felt ready to carry it. Outside, the town slept peacefully, unaware that their newest resident had become the guardian of treasures that could change lives around the world. Frank looked up at Cornelius's portrait and nodded, accepting not just the inheritance, but the obligation that came with it. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new complexities, new tests of whether he was worthy of the trust his great-uncle had placed in him. But tonight Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that his life had meaning beyond mere survival, that he had been chosen for something important, and that he might actually be capable of living up to that choice. Frank woke to find original blueprints of the mansion spread across Cornelius's desk like battle plans. He'd found them tucked behind other documents in the wall-safe architectural drawings from 1923, detailed enough to show every room, closet, and structural element. The discrepancies were subtle but telling. The library was shown as a simple, rectangular room in the original plans, but the current layout included the alcove where the hidden passage was located. Someone had modified the space after construction, adding the secret chamber with remarkable skill. But what worried Frank most was what the blueprints didn't show. According to the original plans, there should have been another room adjacent to the library, a small study that would have shared a wall with the hidden chamber. In the current layout, that space simply didn't exist. Sarah arrived early, bringing fresh coffee and a stack of genealogical research. She found Frank hunched over the blueprints, his eyes red with exhaustion. "Please tell me you got some sleep," she said, though his appearance made the answer obvious. Couldn't stop thinking. Frank showed her the discrepancies he'd discovered. "Look at this. The original blueprint shows a room here that doesn't exist anymore. What if Cornelius wasn't the only one who modified the mansion? What if there are other hidden spaces we haven't found?" Sarah studied the drawings with systematic attention. "It's possible. Victorian mansions were often modified over the years, as needs changed. But why would someone wall off an entire room to hide something even more important than what we've already found?" They spent the morning conducting a thorough architectural survey, measuring rooms and comparing findings to the original blueprints. The missing study should have been accessible from the main hallway, but that section of wall showed no signs of ever containing a door. Frank was examining the hallway's wainscoting when he heard vehicles outside, multiple cars pulling into the driveway, doors slamming, the kind of purposeful activity that usually meant trouble. Through the front window, Frank saw 3 black SUVs parked in his driveway. Men and women in dark suits were emerging from the vehicles, their movements coordinated with law enforcement precision. Frank's military training kicked in immediately. Assess the threat, identify escape routes, prepare for confrontation. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to go upstairs. Now, what's happening?" "I don't know, but I have a feeling we're about to find out." The knock on the front door was polite but insistent. Frank opened it to find a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, with the serious expression of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "Mr. Delaney? I'm Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, FBI Art Crime Team. We'd like to speak with you about some historical artifacts that may be located on this property." Frank's heart hammered, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not sure what you mean." "May we come in? This is a matter of some urgency, and it would be better if we could discuss it privately." Frank had no choice but to step aside. Agent Martinez was followed by 3 other agents, all carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested they knew more about his situation than he was comfortable with. They gathered in the mansion's front parlor, a room Frank had cleared but hadn't yet restored. The federal agents looked oddly out of place among the dust covers and water-stained wallpaper. "Mr. Delaney," Agent Martinez began, "we're investigating the wartime activities of a group called the Heritage Preservation Society. Our research indicates that your great-uncle, Cornelius Ashford, may have been involved with this organization." Frank chose his words carefully. "I inherited this property recently. I don't know much about my great-uncle's activities during the war." "We understand that, but we have reason to believe that artifacts recovered by the Heritage Preservation Society may still be located at various sites throughout New England. As Mr. Ashford's heir, you may have unknowingly inherited responsibility for items that belong to other parties. One of the other agents, a younger man with careful eyes, spoke up. We're not here to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Mr. Delaney, the Heritage Preservation Society appears to have been a legitimate operation that saved cultural artifacts from destruction during World War II. But the legal ownership of those artifacts is complicated, and there are families who have been searching for their property for decades. Frank felt sweat forming on his palms. What exactly are you looking for? Agent Martinez consulted a file folder. According to our research, the Heritage Preservation Society operated a network of secure storage facilities. Some items were returned to their rightful owners after the war, but many were not. We're conducting systematic searches of properties associated with network members. And you want to search this property? With your permission, yes. We have a warrant if necessary, but we prefer to proceed cooperatively. Frank's mind raced. The hidden chamber contained enough evidence to validate the agent's suspicions and more. But simply turning over the collection to federal investigators wouldn't necessarily ensure that the art ended up with the right people. It might just disappear into government storage, while bureaucrats spent years sorting out legal technicalities. I'll need to see that warrant, Frank said. Agent Martinez nodded approvingly. Smart man? Agent Chun? The younger agent produced a document that Frank examined carefully. The warrant was legitimate and comprehensive, authorizing a search for cultural artifacts, artwork, documents, and other items potentially connected to wartime art recovery operations. Frank realized he was out of options. The agents would find the hidden chamber whether he cooperated or not, and his best chance of maintaining any control over the situation was to appear helpful rather than obstructive. All right, he said. But I want to be present during the search, and I want everything documented. Of course. The search began in the library, which Frank found grimly appropriate. Agent Martinez examined the room with professional thoroughness, noting the expensive furnishings, the quality of the books, the portrait of Cornelius above the fireplace. Your great-uncle was clearly a cultured man, she observed. Art history, European literature, classical music. The kind of person who would have understood the cultural significance of the artifacts his network was preserving. Frank watched her examine the desk, wondering if she would discover the hidden mechanism. But Agent Martinez was focused on the contents of the drawers, the papers scattered across the surface. The obvious rather than the concealed dot. It was Agent Chun who found the trigger. He was photographing the room systematically when he noticed the same discrepancy in the bookshelf that Frank and Sarah had discovered, the variation in depth that suggested space behind the wall. Agent Martinez, he called. I think we have something here. Frank's stomach dropped as the younger agent began examining the bookshelf more carefully, looking for the mechanism that would reveal the hidden passage. Frank considered claiming ignorance, pretending he'd never discovered the chamber, hoping the agents would overlook the trigger mechanism. But as Agent Chun's examination grew more methodical, Frank realized that deception would only make his situation worse. These people were experts at finding hidden things, and they clearly had information about the Heritage Preservation Society's methods. Agent Martinez, Frank said quietly, there's something you should know. She turned to face him, her expression sharpening with professional interest. I found a hidden mechanism a few days ago, Frank continued. Behind that bookshelf. There's a passage that leads to a concealed room. Agent Martinez nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. Will you show us? Frank demonstrated the trigger mechanism, and the agents watched with professional interest as the bookshelf swung open to reveal the passage beyond. Agent Martinez played her flashlight beam down the corridor, her expression unreadable. Mr. Delaney, she said, I want you to understand that your cooperation here is noted and appreciated. The Heritage Preservation Society appears to have been operating with good intentions, and we're not looking to prosecute anyone for trying to save cultural artifacts from destruction. Frank led them through the passage to the climate-controlled chamber, his heart pounding as they entered the space where Cornelius had preserved his extraordinary collection. The agent's reactions were everything Frank had expected: professional amazement, careful documentation, the kind of respectful attention that priceless artifacts deserved. Agent Martinez walked among the paintings and sculptures, consulting a tablet computer that apparently contained extensive databases of missing artwork. Every few minutes, she would pause at a particular piece, taking photographs and making notes. "This is remarkable," she said, stopping before a Monet water lily painting. "This piece has been missing since 1943. The Bernstein family has been searching for it for 70 years. Frank watched her examine Cornelius's provenance documentation, noting the careful records his great-uncle had maintained about each item in the collection. "Your great-uncle was meticulous," Agent Martinez observed. "These records are better than what we find in most museums." He clearly understood the importance of maintaining proper documentation. "What happens now?" Frank asked. Agent Martinez looked around the chamber, taking in the scope of the collection. "Now, we begin the process of determining rightful ownership and arranging for proper repatriation. It's going to take time, months, possibly years, but these pieces will finally be returned to the families they belong to." 3 days after the FBI team finished their initial examination of Cornelius's command center, Frank found a coded letter slipped under the mansion's front door. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in careful script on cream-colored paper. Frank carried the letter to the library, settling into Cornelius's chair before opening it. The text was brief, but immediately recognizable as cipher. "The northern light guides those who preserve what matters. When autumn leaves fall twice, the careful observer sees patterns others miss. C.A. knew the value of patience and the price of haste. Trust comes slowly to those who carry the burden of history. The compass points true when held by steady hands." Below the coded text were numbers: 157-238-125-1819. At the bottom, a single initial, T. Frank studied the message for an hour, trying various approaches to break the cipher. It wasn't immediately obvious, not a simple substitution code or basic numeric cipher, but something about the phrasing felt familiar. Sarah provided the breakthrough when she arrived with research materials about wartime cryptography. She took one look at the letter and recognized the pattern. "It's a book cipher," she said. "The numbers correspond to specific words in a predetermined text. The trick is figuring out which book." Frank's eyes went to the extensive library surrounding them. "Could be any of these volumes." "Not necessarily. Look at the message again. C.A. knew the value of patience. C.A. is obviously Cornelius Ashford. And this phrase about the compass points true when held by steady hands, that's referencing the antique compass on his desk." Frank picked up the compass, examining it more carefully. The brass surface was engraved with decorative elements, but now he noticed something he'd missed: tiny numbers etched along the rim, almost invisible. "Page numbers," Sarah breathed. "The compass isn't just a navigation tool, it's the key to a specific book cipher." They spent 2 hours checking the numbers against various volumes in Cornelius's collection, looking for a pattern that would unlock the coded message. Frank finally found the right text, a first edition of Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Its pages worn with use and marked with nearly invisible pencil notations, using the compass numbers as a guide to specific pages and the coded digits. To identify individual words, the message gradually revealed itself. Federal investigation compromised security. Network members advised extreme caution. Ashford Estate now under surveillance. Heritage collection relocated per emergency protocols. Contact requires authentication. Museum acquisition proceeds as planned. Time grows short. Frank and Sarah stared at the decoded message, its implications sinking in slowly. Someone else knows about the Heritage Preservation Society, Sarah said. Someone who's still active in the network. Frank's mind raced through possibilities. The federal agents had seemed convinced that the network was historical, that Cornelius had been operating alone in recent years. But this message suggested an ongoing organization with resources and protocols for dealing with exactly the kind of government investigation they just experienced. The initial at the bottom, Frank said. T. Who do you think that could be? Sarah was already pulling out the photograph they'd found days earlier, showing Cornelius with other network members in 1944. T.S., she said, pointing to one of the figures. According to Cornelius's notes, that could be Thomas Steinberg. Frank studied the photograph more carefully. Thomas Steinberg appeared to be in his 20s in the 1944 image, which would make him over 100 years old now if he was still alive. We need to find out who T is, Frank said. And we need to understand what they mean about museum acquisition and emergency protocols. Their research took on new urgency. Sarah used her library connections to investigate the current status of network members, while Frank studied Cornelius's recently discovered files for clues about ongoing operations. What they found was both impressive and disturbing. The Heritage Preservation Society had evolved far beyond its wartime origins, becoming a sophisticated international network focused on recovering stolen cultural artifacts. They had contacts in auction houses, museums, and government agencies around the world. They had methods for tracking stolen art through the legitimate market and resources for purchasing pieces that came up for sale. But they also operated in legal, gray areas that made Frank uncomfortable. Some of their recovery methods skirted the edges of legality, and their secrecy suggested they didn't always trust official channels to handle sensitive cases appropriately. Look at this, Sarah said, showing Frank a document from one of Cornelius's files. They've been monitoring auction houses for pieces with questionable provenance. When something surfaces that they believe was stolen, they either bid on it themselves or alert the appropriate authorities, depending on which approach is more likely to result in proper repatriation. Frank examined the document, noting the sophisticated analysis of auction records, provenance documentation, and legal ownership issues. This isn't just about recovering individual pieces. They're tracking patterns, identifying dealers and collectors who specialize in trafficking stolen art. And now, Sarah said quietly, they think the federal investigation has compromised their ability to operate. The implications were sobering. If Frank's cooperation with the FBI had inadvertently damaged an ongoing effort to recover stolen cultural heritage, then his good intentions might have caused more harm than good. That evening, Frank sat in the mansion's conservatory, trying to make sense of the ethical complexities surrounding him. Through the tall windows, he could see lights and houses across the street, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that their newest neighbor had become entangled in a web of international art recovery, federal investigation, and historical justice. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. Agent Martinez's voice was tense with excitement. Mr. Delaney, we need to talk. Our analysis of your great-uncle's files has uncovered something significant. Can you meet us at the mansion first thing tomorrow morning? Frank agreed, though he wondered what new complications were about to enter his already bewildering situation. After the call ended, he returned to the coded letter, studying it for clues he might have missed. It was the phrase about autumn leaves fall twice that eventually caught his attention. Frank had assumed it was poetic language, but now he wondered if it might be more literal. He walked through the mansion's rooms, looking for something that might relate to autumn or falling leaves. In the conservatory, he found what he was looking for: a painting of a New England autumn scene, prominently displayed where anyone entering the room would see it immediately. But as Frank examined the painting more closely, he discovered that it wasn't quite what it appeared to be. The canvas was mounted in an unusual frame, one that allowed it to swing away from the wall like a hinged door. Behind the painting was a small safe, its combination lock gleaming in the moonlight streaming through the conservatory windows. Frank's heart pounded as he realized what he'd found: another of Cornelius's hiding places, one that the federal agents had missed during their search. But without the combination, the safe might as well have been sealed forever. He studied the coded letter again, looking for numbers that might serve as a combination. The page numbers from the compass cipher were too long, but there might be other numerical references hidden in the text. It was the phrase, "When autumn leaves fall twice," that provided the solution. Frank counted the letters in each word. When had 4 letters. Autumn had 6. Leaves had 6. Fall had 4. Twice had 5. The combination 46645 opened the safe on the first try. Inside, Frank found documents that explained everything. The Heritage Preservation Society was indeed still active, operating under the cover of a legitimate cultural foundation that purchased and donated artwork to museums. Thomas Steinberg was still alive, 103 years old, and living in a Boston retirement community, but still mentally sharp and actively involved in the network's operations. The museum acquisition mentioned in the coded letter referred to a major donation the network was planning: dozens of recovered pieces that would be given to Holocaust museums and cultural institutions around the world. But the federal investigation had complicated their timeline, making it necessary to accelerate the process before government bureaucracy could interfere. The most significant document was a letter addressed to Frank personally, written in Cornelius's hand and dated just 1 month before his death. "My dear Francis, if you are reading this, it means you have shown the wisdom and persistence necessary to uncover the deeper layers of what I have bequeathed to you. The Heritage Preservation Society is not just history. It is a living mission that requires living guardians. The federal authorities mean well, but they do not understand the urgency of our work or the delicate relationships we have built over decades. I have recommended you to the network as my successor, pending your acceptance of the responsibilities involved. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Time is not our ally." Frank closed the safe and returned the painting to its position, his mind spinning with the implications of what he'd discovered. He wasn't just the heir to a mansion and a hidden art collection. He was the chosen successor to lead an international network dedicated to recovering stolen cultural heritage. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing. But instead, Frank felt something like relief. For days, he'd been struggling with the sense that the federal investigation had taken away his purpose, that his brief guardianship of Cornelius's treasures had ended before he could prove himself worthy of the trust. Now he understood that the real test wasn't in protecting what Cornelius had already saved. It was in continuing the work, in taking on the active mission of recovering what was still lost and ensuring it found its way to the right hands. The phone call from Agent Martinez suddenly took on new significance. If the FBI had discovered something in Cornelius's files that revealed the network's ongoing activities, then Frank's decision about whether to join the Heritage Preservation Society might be made for him. He could cooperate with the federal investigation and help destroy an organization that had spent 70 years recovering stolen art. Or he could find a way to protect the network while still serving the cause of justice. Frank spent the night walking through the mansion, thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between legal compliance and moral responsibility. By dawn, He had made his decision. When Agent Martinez arrived that morning, she would find Frank Delaney ready to take on responsibilities he'd never imagined accepting. But first, he needed to make contact with Thomas Steinberg. The network needed to know that Cornelius's successor was ready to join their ranks, and they needed to coordinate their response to the federal investigation before more damage was done. Frank retrieved the coded letter and began composing his own cipher, using the same book and compass system Cornelius had established. His message was brief but clear. Successor accepts responsibility. Ready for briefing. Recommend immediate coordination on federal response. Time understood to be critical. Authentication available upon request. As the sun rose over Millbrook, Frank sealed his coded response in an envelope and prepared to deliver it through whatever channels the Heritage Preservation Society used for secure communication. He was no longer just Frank Delaney, homeless man who'd inherited more than he could handle. He was Frank Delaney, guardian of cultural heritage, member of a secret network dedicated to justice for families whose treasures had been stolen by history's worst criminals. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life that had chosen him. Agent Martinez arrived exactly at 9, accompanied by the same team that had discovered Cornelius's command center. But their demeanor was different this morning, more urgent, more concerned. Frank met them in the library, trying to project calm despite the coded letter hidden in his jacket pocket. "Mr. Delaney," Agent Martinez began without preamble, "our analysis of your great-uncle's files has revealed something that changes the entire scope of our investigation." She opened a laptop computer and turned the screen toward Frank. On it was a detailed organizational chart showing connections between dozens of individuals, institutions, and locations across North America and Europe. The Heritage Preservation Society isn't just a historical network, Agent Martinez continued. It's still active, and it's far larger than we initially realized. Your great-uncle was apparently one of the senior coordinators, but there are at least 20 other active members we've identified so far. Frank studied the chart, recognizing some of the names from Cornelius's files. "What exactly are they doing?" Agent Chum spoke up. "According to the financial records we've analyzed, they facilitated the recovery and repatriation of artwork worth over $50 million in the past 5 years alone. But here's the problem, not all of their methods are entirely legal." Frank's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Agent Martinez clicked to another screen showing auction records, insurance claims, and police reports. They've been using questionable tactics to acquire pieces they believe were stolen. Industrial espionage to identify auction house sources. Computer hacking to access private collection databases. Even what appears to be burglary in at least 3 documented cases. Burglary? Art theft for the purpose of repatriation, Agent Chun clarified. They identify pieces in private collections that they believe were stolen during the war. Then they take them back. From their perspective, they're recovering stolen property. From the legal system's perspective, they're committing felonies. Frank felt the ground shifting beneath him. The noble mission he'd thought he was inheriting suddenly looked far more complicated. "Are you saying my great-uncle was involved in criminal activities?" "We're saying the Heritage Preservation Society operates in legal gray areas that sometimes cross into criminal territory," Agent Martinez replied. "Your great-uncle appears to have been the moderating influence in the organization. He preferred to work through legitimate channels when possible. But not all network members share his restraint." She showed Frank another document. This one, a heated email exchange between Cornelius and someone identified only as Phoenix. Phoenix was advocating for more aggressive tactics, arguing that waiting for legal processes was allowing stolen art to disappear into private collections where it might never be recovered. Cornelius had responded with concerns about maintaining the network's moral authority and avoiding actions that could discredit their legitimate recovery efforts. The last exchange in this thread is dated 2 months before your great-uncle's death, Agent Martinez noted. Phoenix was pushing for immediate action on what they called Priority Target 7. Cornelius refused to authorize the operation, saying it was too risky and would expose the entire network to legal jeopardy. Frank studied the email thread, noting the increasing tension between the correspondents. What was Priority Target 7? Agent Chun consulted his notes. A private collector in Newport named Hadley Van der Berg. Our preliminary investigation suggests he has at least 15 pieces in his collection that were likely stolen during World War II. The network had been monitoring him for 3 years, building a case for legal recovery action. And Phoenix wanted to steal them instead. Phoenix wanted to recover them by whatever means necessary, Agent Martinez corrected. The distinction matters from their perspective, though not from ours. Frank absorbed this information, realizing that his decision about joining the Heritage Preservation Society had become infinitely more complex. How could he support an organization that committed crimes, even if their motivations were noble? There's something else, Agent Martinez continued. Based on the patterns we've identified in your great-uncle's communications, we believe Phoenix is planning to move forward with the Newport operation, despite Cornelius's objections. If they succeed, it could trigger a massive criminal investigation that would destroy the network's ability to continue their legitimate recovery work. Frank felt a chill as he understood the implications. You want me to help you stop them. We want you to help us find a way to preserve the network's legitimate activities while preventing them from crossing lines that would make them criminals rather than cultural preservationists. Agent Chun leaned forward. Mr. Delaney, you're in a unique position. As Cornelius's heir and designated successor, you have credibility with the network that we could never establish. If you could make contact with Phoenix and convince them to pursue legal channels, you want me to go undercover. Frank interrupted. Agent Martinez nodded. Informally, yes. We're not asking you to wear a wire or gather evidence for prosecution. We're asking you to use your influence to prevent a situation that would destroy an organization that has done tremendous good work. Frank stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town that had become his unlikely home. The request made sense from the FBI's perspective. They could preserve the network's legitimate activities while preventing criminal behavior. But it also put Frank in an impossible position, asking him to betray people who saw him as Cornelius's chosen successor. What if I refuse? Frank asked. Then we proceed with a full criminal investigation, Agent Martinez replied. We'll arrest the network members we can identify, seize their assets, and let the courts sort out the legal ownership issues. It could take years, and in the meantime, families will continue waiting for art that might be sitting in evidence lockers. Frank turned back to face the agents. And if I cooperate? We work together to find a solution that preserves the network's mission while keeping them within legal boundaries. The families who have been searching for their stolen heritage continue to receive help, but through proper channels. The offer was seductive, but Frank had learned to be suspicious of solutions that seemed too convenient. There was something the agents weren't telling him, some complication they were holding back. What aren't you telling me? Frank asked directly. Agent Martinez and Agent Chun exchanged glances. Finally, Agent Martinez sighed and opened another file on her laptop. The Newport collector, Hadley Van der Berg. He's not just a private individual with questionable artwork, she said. He's connected to a network of dealers and collectors who specialize in trafficking stolen cultural artifacts. If Phoenix moves against him, they're not just risking criminal charges. They're potentially walking into a trap. Frank felt his pulse quicken. What kind of trap? Van der Berg has been under investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies for years, Agent Chun explained. Customs, IRS, Interpol, everyone wants him, but no one has been able to build a solid case. He's smart, well-connected, and very careful about maintaining plausible deniability for his acquisitions. He's also ruthless, Agent Martinez added. 2 years ago, an investigative journalist who was looking into his collection died in what appeared to be a random mugging. 6 months later, an art historian who was preparing a paper about stolen works in private collections died in a car. Accident. Could be coincidence, but you don't think so, Frank finished. We think Vanderberg has resources and connections that make him extremely dangerous to anyone who threatens his operation. If Phoenix attempts to recover artwork from his collection, they could be walking into a situation that gets them killed. Frank absorbed this information, understanding now why the agents had approached him. This wasn't just about preventing criminal activity. It was about preventing Phoenix from making a potentially fatal mistake. How much time do we have? Frank asked. Based on the communication patterns we've analyzed, we think Phoenix is planning to move within the next 2 weeks, Agent Martinez replied. Possibly sooner if they believe the federal investigation is closing in on them. Frank nodded, his decision crystallizing. I'll need to make contact with the network, but I want guarantees about how this information will be used, and I want protection for the people who have been doing legitimate recovery work. Agent Martinez smiled for the first time since arriving. We were hoping you'd say that. As the agents packed up their materials and prepared to leave, Frank felt the weight of a new kind of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just inheriting Cornelius's legacy. He was being asked to save it from destruction, to find a way to preserve the network's mission while protecting its members from their own good intentions. After the agents left, Frank retrieved the coded letter from his pocket and studied it again. The message about trusting carefully and time growing short took on new meaning now that he understood the stakes involved. He spent the afternoon preparing his own coded response, but now the message was more complex. He needed to establish his credentials as Cornelius's successor while also warning Phoenix about the dangers they were walking into. It was a delicate balance. Too much information might reveal his cooperation with federal agents. Too little might allow Phoenix to proceed with a plan that could get them killed. Frank's final message was carefully crafted. Successor confirmed, and briefed on current operations. Strongly advise caution regarding Priority Target 7. Federal surveillance more extensive than realized. Alternative approaches may achieve same objectives with reduced risk. Request immediate consultation before proceeding with any direct action. Authentication available through established protocols. As evening fell over Millbrook, Frank sealed his coded message and prepared to deliver it through the same channels that had brought him the original communication. He was no longer just an observer of the Heritage Preservation Society's activities. He was an active participant in a mission that could either preserve their noble work or destroy it entirely. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but Frank had learned something important over the past week. Sometimes the most important decisions couldn't be made safely from a distance with perfect information. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts, accept the risks, and hope that good intentions could lead to good outcomes even when the path wasn't clear. Frank Delaney, homeless man turned heir turned guardian of cultural heritage, was about to discover whether he had the courage to live up to Cornelius's faith in him. The test wouldn't be in protecting what had already been saved. It would be in finding a way to continue the mission without losing everything in the process. The response came faster than Frank had expected. He found it the next morning, slipped under the mansion's kitchen door, a different entry point than before, suggesting the network had multiple ways of accessing the property without being detected. This time, the coded message was longer and more complex, requiring nearly 2 hours to decipher using Cornelius's book cipher system. When Frank finally decoded the full text, the urgency of the situation became clear. Successor authentication confirmed through established protocols. Phoenix team already en route to Newport. Primary mission launches in 72 hours regardless of federal complications. Van der Berg collection contains Bernstein family Picasso, Rosenberg manuscript collection, and Meyer sculpture series. Too valuable to leave in criminal hands while legal processes drag on for years. Extraction planned for Friday evening during charity gala, when security will be focused on guests rather than collection. Your concerns noted, but overruled by operational necessity. Join us or stay clear. No middle ground possible. Frank's hands shook as he read the decoded message. Phoenix wasn't just planning a burglary. They were planning it for a public event, where dozens of innocent people could be caught in the crossfire if something went wrong. And based on Agent Martinez's warnings about Van der Berg's connections and ruthlessness, something going wrong seemed like a very real possibility. Frank immediately called Agent Martinez, using the secure number she'd provided. Her response was grim but not surprised. "We were afraid this might happen," she said. "Phoenix has been planning this operation for months, and they're not going to back down just because we've discovered the network's existence. What are you doing to stop them? Officially? Nothing. We don't have enough evidence to justify arrests. And we can't protect someone who's actively engaged in criminal enterprises. Unofficially, we're trying to coordinate with Newport Police to increase security around Van der Berg's property, but we can't tell them why without revealing our investigation." Frank felt a surge of frustration. "So you're just going to let this happen?" "Mr. Delaney, we're asking you to prevent it from happening. You're the only person who has credibility with Phoenix and who understands the full scope of what's at stake." Agent Martinez arranged to meet Frank that afternoon at a coffee shop in Boston, far enough from Millbrook to avoid local attention. When Frank arrived, he found her sitting with an older man he didn't recognize, someone with the bearing of authority and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "Mr. Delaney," Agent Martinez said, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Director Harrison from our art crime team headquarters. He's been briefed on the situation." Harrison studied Frank with sharp intelligence. "Agent Martinez tells me you're willing to help us resolve this situation." Frank nodded. "I want to prevent Phoenix from making a mistake that could get people killed and destroy the network's legitimate activities." "Good," Harrison said, "because we've discovered some additional information about Hadley Van der Berg that makes this situation even more dangerous than we initially realized." Harrison opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. "Van der Berg isn't just a collector of stolen art. He's a facilitator for international money laundering operations. He uses high-value artwork to move cash between countries, helping criminal organizations convert dirty money into clean assets." Frank studied photographs of Van der Berg's Newport mansion, noting the sophisticated security systems and the armed guards visible in several images. "If Phoenix attempts to break into this collection," Harrison continued, "they're not just risking arrest for burglary. They're potentially interfering with ongoing federal investigations into organized crime operations that extend far beyond stolen artwork." "What kind of organized crime?" Frank asked. "The kind that kills people who interfere with their business," Harrison replied bluntly. "Mr. Delaney, we need you to understand that Phoenix isn't just planning a burglary. They're planning to walk into the middle of a complex federal investigation involving drug trafficking, money laundering, and international criminal enterprises." The response came faster than Frank had expected. He found it the next morning, slipped under the mansion's kitchen door, a different entry point than before, suggesting the network had multiple ways of accessing the property without being detected. This time, the coded message was longer and more complex, requiring nearly 2 hours to decipher using Cornelius's book cipher system. When Frank finally decoded the full text, the urgency of the situation became clear. Successor authentication confirmed through established protocols. Phoenix team already en route to Newport. Primary mission launches in 72 hours, regardless of federal complications. Van der Berg collection contains Bernstein family Picasso, Rosenberg manuscript collection, and Meyer sculpture series, too valuable to leave in criminal hands while legal processes drag on for years. Extraction planned for Friday evening during charity gala, when security will be focused on guests rather than collection. Your concerns noted, but overruled by operational necessity. Join us or stay clear. No middle ground possible. Frank's hand shook as he read the decoded message. Phoenix wasn't just planning a burglary. They were planning it for a public event where dozens of innocent people could be caught in the crossfire if something went wrong. And based on Agent Martinez's warnings about Van der Berg's connections and ruthlessness, something going wrong seemed like a very real possibility. Frank immediately called Agent Martinez, using the secure number she'd provided. Her response was grim but not surprised. "We were afraid this might happen," she said. "Phoenix has been planning this operation for months, and they're not going to back down just because we've discovered the network's existence. What are you doing to stop them? Officially? Nothing. We don't have enough evidence to justify arrests. And we can't protect someone who's actively engaged in criminal enterprises. Unofficially, we're trying to coordinate with Newport Police to increase security around Van der Berg's property. But we can't tell them why without revealing our investigation." Frank felt a surge of frustration. "So you're just going to let this happen?" "Mr. Delaney, we're asking you to prevent it from happening. You're the only person who has credibility with Phoenix and who understands the full scope of what's at stake." Agent Martinez arranged to meet Frank that afternoon at a coffee shop in Boston, far enough from Millbrook to avoid local attention. When Frank arrived, he found her sitting with an older man he didn't recognize, someone with the bearing of authority and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "Mr. Delaney," Agent Martinez said, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Director Harrison from our art crime team headquarters. He's been briefed on the situation." Harrison studied Frank with sharp intelligence. "Agent Martinez tells me you're willing to help us resolve this situation." Frank nodded. "I want to prevent Phoenix from making a mistake that could get people killed and destroy the network's legitimate activities." "Good," Harrison said, "because we've discovered some additional information about Hadley Van der Berg that makes this situation even more dangerous than we initially realized." Harrison opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. "Van der Berg isn't just a collector of stolen art. He's a facilitator for international money laundering operations. He uses high-value artwork to move cash between countries, helping criminal organizations convert dirty money into clean assets." Frank studied photographs of Van der Berg's Newport mansion, noting the sophisticated security systems and the armed guards visible in several images. "If Phoenix attempts to break into this collection," Harrison continued, "they're not just risking arrest for burglary. They're potentially interfering with ongoing federal investigations into organized crime operations that extend far beyond stolen artwork." "What kind of organized crime?" Frank asked. "The kind that kills people who interfere with their business," Harrison replied bluntly. "Mr. Delaney, we need you to understand that Phoenix isn't just planning a burglary. They're planning to walk into the middle of a complex federal investigation involving drug trafficking, money laundering, and international criminal enterprises." Agent Martinez leaned forward. "There's a reason Van der Berg has never been successfully prosecuted despite decades of questionable activities. He's protected by people who have resources we can't always match and methods we can't always anticipate." Frank felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him again. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Harrison's expression was grave. "We're asking you to infiltrate Phoenix's operation and find a way to stop it from proceeding. Not just delay it, stop it completely." Frank stared at the photographs of Van der Berg's heavily fortified mansion. "You want me to betray people?" who see me as Cornelius's chosen successor. We want you to save them from themselves, Agent Martinez corrected. Mr. Delaney, based on our intelligence, Phoenix's team consists of 3 people, all of them academics or museum professionals, with no real-world experience in this kind of operation. They're walking into a situation that trained federal agents would approach with extreme caution. Harrison pulled out another set of documents. Thomas Steinberg, 103 years old, retired professor of art history, the Phoenix you've been corresponding with. Dr. Elena Vasquez, 62, former curator at the Metropolitan Museum, expert in Renaissance art, and Dr. James Morrison, 58, genealogical researcher who spent 20 years tracking down families of Holocaust victims. Frank recognized the names from Cornelius's files. These are good people trying to do the right thing. Exactly, Harrison said. Which is why they're going to get themselves killed if someone doesn't stop them. They see this as a moral imperative recovering. Stolen art for families who've been searching for it for decades. But they don't understand the realities of what they're up against. Agent Martinez showed Frank surveillance photographs of Vanderberg's property during the previous year's charity gala. Look at this security arrangement. Professional guards, electronic surveillance, coordinated response protocols. This isn't some wealthy collector with a few expensive paintings. This is a fortress designed to protect illegal operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Frank studied the images, his military training automatically analyzing sightlines, entry points, and defensive positions. The mansion was indeed a fortress, but it was also a public venue during charity events. The security would be focused on protecting the guests and managing crowd control, not preventing sophisticated infiltration. Phoenix's plan might actually work, Frank said quietly. Harrison and Agent Martinez exchanged glances. That's exactly what we're afraid of, Harrison replied. If they succeed in stealing artwork from Vanderberg's collection, they won't just be committing burglary. They'll be interfering with federal investigations and potentially exposing themselves to retaliation from criminal organizations that don't forgive interference. Frank felt the familiar weight of command decisions settling on his shoulders. He'd faced similar choices during his military service situations where there were no good options, only degrees of bad outcomes that had to be managed as carefully as possible. What's your plan? Frank asked. Agent Martinez opened her laptop and showed him a detailed timeline. The charity gala is Friday evening. We believe Phoenix will attempt their operation during the event, when security attention is divided between protecting guests and monitoring the collection. We want you to make contact with the team before then and convince them to abort the mission. And if I can't convince them? Harrison's expression was grim. Then we'll have to arrest them before they can proceed. It's not an ideal solution. It will expose our investigation and potentially compromise other aspects of the Heritage Preservation Society's legitimate work. But it's better than letting them walk into a situation that could get them killed. Frank spent the afternoon studying the operational details Harrison and Agent Martinez had provided. The FBI's intelligence on Vanderberg's security arrangements was extensive and sobering. The collector maintained a staff of professionally trained guards, sophisticated electronic surveillance systems, and direct connections to both local police and private security firms. But it was the personal details about Phoenix's team members that weighed most heavily on Frank's mind. Thomas Steinberg had survived the Holocaust as a child, had spent his entire adult life working to recover cultural artifacts stolen by the Nazis. Dr. Vasquez had dedicated her career to returning artwork to families who thought it was lost forever. Dr. Morrison had personally reunited over 50 families with ancestral possessions they'd given up hope of finding. These weren't criminals motivated by greed. They were heroes motivated by justice. But heroism without tactical awareness could be just as dangerous as criminal intent. Frank returned to Millbrook that evening with a plan forming in his mind. He couldn't betray Phoenix to the FBI, but he also couldn't allow them to proceed with an operation that would likely result in their deaths or imprisonment. He needed to find a third option, a way to satisfy their moral imperatives while protecting them from the consequences of their noble intentions. The solution came to him as he sat in Cornelius's library, surrounded by books that represented centuries of human knowledge and wisdom. What if Phoenix's mission could be accomplished without breaking into Van der Berg's mansion? What if the stolen artwork could be recovered through legal channels that would be more effective and less dangerous than burglary? Frank spent the night researching Van der Berg's background, using resources from both Cornelius's files and publicly available information. What he discovered was a pattern of acquisition practices that were questionable but not necessarily illegal private sales, auction purchases, estate acquisitions that all involved artwork with incomplete or suspicious provenance documentation. But Frank also found something else, evidence that Van der Berg's collection had been growing rapidly in recent years, with new acquisitions that suggested he was actively seeking specific pieces rather than simply accumulating valuable art. The pattern looked like someone filling orders, acquiring particular works for clients who preferred to remain anonymous. By morning, Frank had developed a strategy that might satisfy both Phoenix's need for justice and the FBI's need to prevent a criminal operation. But it would require convincing all parties to trust him with information they preferred to keep secret, and it would require him to take risks that could destroy his credibility with everyone involved. Frank drafted 2 messages, one coded for Phoenix and one direct for Agent Martinez. To Phoenix, he wrote, "Alternative approach identified that may achieve all objectives without operational risks. Request immediate meeting to discuss legal recovery options that could be more effective than direct action. Time critical, but solutions possible through established channels." To Agent Martinez, he sent a more direct communication. "Prepared to proceed with infiltration as discussed. Believe I can convince Phoenix to abort current operation in favor of alternative approach. We'll need FBI cooperation for legal strategy that addresses their legitimate concerns about stolen artwork. Meeting arranged for tomorrow evening." As Frank sealed both messages, he realized he was committing himself to a course of action that could either resolve the crisis peacefully or make it infinitely worse. If he couldn't convince Phoenix to trust his alternative approach, they would proceed with their dangerous burglary plan. If he couldn't deliver on his promises to provide legal alternatives, both Phoenix and the FBI would view him as unreliable. But Frank had learned something important during his years of military service and his years on the streets sometimes. The only way forward was through the middle of the problem, accepting risks that couldn't be calculated in advance, and trusting that good intentions could overcome bad circumstances. The next 24 hours would determine whether Frank Delaney was worthy of the trust Cornelius had placed in him, whether he could live up to the legacy of the Heritage Preservation Society while protecting its members from their own dedication to justice. The meeting was set for 7 o'clock at a small diner in Worcester, chosen because it was halfway between Boston and the Berkshire location where Phoenix's team had been preparing for their Newport operation. Frank arrived early, choosing a corner booth where he could watch the entrance while remaining inconspicuous. Thomas Steinberg arrived exactly on time, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had betrayed him but whose mind remained sharp. At 103, he was smaller and more fragile than Frank had expected, but his eyes held the fierce intelligence of someone who had spent 8 decades fighting for justice. Dr. Elena Vasquez and Dr. James Morrison followed a few minutes later. Vasquez was elegant and intense, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Morrison looked exactly like what he was, a genealogical researcher who spent his days in archives and libraries. more comfortable with documents than with direct confrontation. Frank stood as they approached his table, extending his hand to each in turn. "Mr. Steinberg, Dr. Vasquez, Dr. Morrison, thank you for coming." Steinberg studied Frank with sharp attention. "You have Cornelius's eyes," he said quietly, and his way of holding himself when he was preparing to say something we wouldn't want to hear. They ordered coffee and settled into an awkward silence while the waitress moved out of earshot. Frank had prepared extensively for this conversation, but facing these three dedicated people heroes who had spent their lives recovering stolen cultural heritage made his mission feel like betrayal rather than protection. "You want us to abandon the Newport operation," Dr. Vasquez said without preamble. "Your coded message was clear enough about that." Frank nodded. "I want you to consider an alternative approach that might be more effective and significantly safer." "Safer? For whom?" Morrison asked. "For us or for the FBI agents who have been monitoring our activities?" Frank felt a chill at Morrison's words. The network knew about the federal investigation, which meant they also knew about his cooperation with Agent Martinez. His position as a mediator had just become infinitely more complicated. "You know about the FBI investigation," Frank said. Steinberg smiled grimly. "Mr. Delaney, we've been operating in legal gray areas for 70 years. Did you think we survived this long without learning to recognize federal surveillance?" Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. "The question is whether you're here as Cornelius's successor or as a federal informant." Frank had expected this challenge, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. "I'm here as someone who believes in the Heritage Preservation Society's mission, and who wants to prevent you from making a mistake that could destroy everything Cornelius spent his life building." "The mistake," Morrison said coldly, "would be allowing Vanderberg to continue profiting from stolen art while families wait for legal processes that may never resolve their claims." Frank pulled out the research he'd compiled about Vanderberg's collection and operations. "You're right about Vanderberg. He's not just a collector. He's a facilitator for international money laundering operations. But that's exactly why a direct assault on his collection is so dangerous." He showed them surveillance photographs provided by Agent Martinez, pointing out the sophisticated security arrangements and the professional guards stationed throughout the property. "These aren't museum security guards," Frank continued. "These are people with military or law enforcement backgrounds, trained to respond to exactly the kind of operation you're planning." Steinberg examined the photographs with the attention of someone who understood tactical situations. "You're suggesting we'll be caught." "I'm suggesting you'll be killed," Frank replied bluntly. "Vanderberg has connections to criminal organizations that don't forgive interference with their operations. If you succeed in taking artwork from his collection, you won't just face legal consequences, you'll face retaliation from people who have resources and methods that law enforcement can't always protect against." Dr. Vasquez's expression remained skeptical. "And your alternative approach?" Frank opened his laptop and showed them the legal strategy he developed with input from Agent Martinez. A coordinated effort involving the FBI art crime team, Holocaust restitution organizations, and genealogical researchers. "Instead of stealing the artwork, we build legal cases for recovery that Vanderberg can't fight successfully." Morrison studied the documents Frank had prepared. "This could take years." "It could," Frank agreed, "but it would be definitive. Legal recovery means the artwork goes directly to the rightful families or appropriate institutions. Theft means the pieces disappear into evidence lockers while courts spend years determining ownership." Steinberg was quiet for a long moment, considering Frank's presentation. "You're asking us to trust a system that has failed these families for 70 years. I'm asking you to trust a system that's finally ready to take action with your help and expertise," Frank replied. "The FBI needs your knowledge to build cases that will hold up in court." Without your research and documentation, they can't prove the provenance issues that would force Van der Berg to surrender the stolen pieces. Frank could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces. These were people who had spent decades fighting bureaucratic inertia, watching legal processes move too slowly while families died waiting for justice. The promise of immediate action was seductive, even if it carried enormous risks. "There's something else," Frank said, playing his final card. "The FBI investigation isn't just about the Heritage Preservation Society. Van der Berg is the target of a much larger operation involving organized crime and international money laundering. If you interfere with that investigation, you could compromise cases that affect thousands of victims beyond just stolen art recovery." Dr. Vasquez looked up sharply. "What kind of cases?" Frank showed them additional documents Agent Martinez had cleared for him to share sanitized. Reports about Van der Berg's connections to drug trafficking organizations and international criminal enterprises. "The FBI's been building a case against Van der Berg's entire operation for 3 years," Frank explained. "If they can prove his money laundering activities, they can seize his entire collection under asset forfeiture laws. Every piece of stolen artwork would be recovered and returned to rightful owners through legal channels." Morrison leaned back in his chair, absorbing the implications. "You're saying that waiting for the FBI investigation might actually be more effective than direct action?" "I'm saying that your direct action could prevent the FBI from building a case that would recover not just the pieces you're targeting, but dozens of other stolen works that Van der Berg has acquired over the years." Steinberg studied Frank's face carefully. "And if we cooperate with this legal approach, what guarantees do we have that the FBI will follow through on their promises?" Frank pulled out a document he'd had Agent Martinez prepare, a formal memorandum of understanding that committed the FBI to working with Heritage Preservation Society researchers to identify and recover stolen artwork in Van der Berg's collection. "This isn't just a promise," Frank said. "It's a binding agreement that gives you official status as consultants on the federal investigation. Your expertise becomes part of the legal case, which means your work directly contributes to recovering the stolen pieces." The 3 Phoenix members examined the agreement carefully, noting the specific commitments the FBI was making regarding timeline, resource allocation, and coordination with restitution organizations. "This is more cooperation than we've ever received from federal agencies," Dr. Vasquez admitted. Frank nodded. "Because this is the first time a federal investigation has aligned with your mission instead of opposing it. Agent Martinez understands that your work is legitimate and valuable. She wants to find a way to make it officially sanctioned instead of forcing you to operate in legal gray areas." Steinberg looked around the table at his colleagues, then back at Frank. "If we accept this approach, what happens to the Newport operation?" "It gets called off," Frank said, "immediately and permanently. The FBI uses legal processes to achieve the same objectives you were planning to accomplish through direct action." Morrison shook his head slowly. 70 years of waiting, and now we're being asked to wait longer. You're being asked to trust that justice can be served through legal channels when those channels are finally ready to serve justice," Frank corrected. "The difference is that this time, you're not waiting passively. You're actively participating in the legal process that will recover the stolen artwork." The silence stretched for several minutes as the Phoenix team considered Frank's proposal. Frank could see the struggle playing out in their expressions, the tension between their desire for immediate action and their recognition that his alternative might actually be more effective. Finally, Steinberg spoke. "Mr. Delaney, you're asking us to trust you with a mission that has defined our lives for decades. That's not a decision we can make lightly." Frank understood. "What would it take for you to trust this approach?" Dr. Vasquez looked at her colleagues, then back at Frank. "Proof that the FBI is serious about following through on their commitments. We've been promised cooperation before, only to watch investigations disappear into bureaucratic delays. Frank pulled out his phone and dialed Agent Martinez's secure number. When she answered, he put the call on speaker. "Agent Martinez, I'm here with Thomas Steinberg, Dr. Elena Vasquez, and Dr. James Morrison from the Heritage Preservation Society. They have questions about the FBI's commitment to recovering stolen artwork through legal channels." Agent Martinez's voice was clear and professional. "Mr. Steinberg, Dr. Vasquez, Dr. Morrison, I want you to know that the art crime team takes cultural heritage recovery very seriously. We're prepared to begin immediate action on the Van der Berg investigation with your assistance." "What kind of immediate action?" Steinberg asked. "Search warrants for his property, subpoenas for his financial records, and coordination with international law enforcement agencies to trace the provenance of specific pieces in his collection. We can have warrants executed within 48 hours if you can provide us with the documentation we need to establish probable cause." Frank watched the Phoenix team's expressions change as they realized Agent Martinez was offering them something they'd never had before: the power of federal law, enforcement resources backing their research and recovery efforts, and the timeline. "For resolution?" Dr. Vasquez asked. "Months, not years," Agent Martinez replied. "This is a priority case with resources already allocated. We're not asking you to wait indefinitely. We're asking you to let us use legal tools that will be more effective than the approaches you've been considering." After Agent Martinez ended the call, the Phoenix team sat in contemplative silence. Frank could see them weighing decades of frustration against the promise of official support, balancing their desire for immediate action against the possibility of more comprehensive results. "All right," Steinberg said finally. "We'll call off the Newport operation and cooperate with the FBI investigation. But we want regular updates on progress, and we want guarantees that recovered artwork will be processed quickly for return to families." Frank felt a surge of relief and accomplishment. "You won't regret this decision." Morrison looked at him. "Seriously?" "We'd better not, Mr. Delaney, because if the FBI fails to follow through on these commitments, the Heritage Preservation Society will resume operations using our own methods. And next time, we won't be asking for anyone's permission." The raid on Van der Berg's Newport mansion happened exactly 48 hours later, just as Agent Martinez had promised. Frank watched the news coverage from his library in Millbrook, Sarah beside him on the leather sofa, both of them transfixed by images of federal agents carrying wooden crates from the imposing Victorian structure. The news reports described it as a federal investigation into money laundering and organized crime, with only brief mentions of cultural artifacts being recovered as evidence. But Frank knew those wooden crates contained treasures that families had been searching for since World War II. His phone rang as the coverage continued. Agent Martinez's voice carried satisfaction that was rare in their previous conversations. "Mr. Delaney, I wanted to personally thank you for your help in resolving this situation. The Phoenix team's documentation was invaluable in establishing probable cause for the search warrants." Frank felt a warm glow of accomplishment. "What did you find?" 17 pieces of artwork with documented stolen provenance, including the Bernstein family Picasso that Phoenix was specifically targeting. Financial records that connect Van der Berg to money laundering operations in 6 countries. And evidence of ongoing trafficking in stolen cultural artifacts worth an estimated $200 million. Sarah squeezed Frank's hand as they listened to Agent Martinez describe the scope of the recovery operation. "More importantly," Agent Martinez continued, "we found contact lists and transaction records that will allow us to trace dozens of other stolen pieces to collectors and dealers around the world. This isn't just about Van der Berg's collection. It's about dismantling an entire network that profits from stolen cultural heritage. Frank felt the significance of what they'd accomplished beginning to sink in. How long before the artwork can be returned to families? That's the best part, Agent Martinez replied. Because we have complete provenance documentation thanks to Phoenix's research, we can begin the repatriation process immediately. The Bernstein family will have their Picasso back within 60 days, and most of the other pieces will follow shortly after. After the call ended, Frank and Sarah sat in contemplative silence, watching the continuing news coverage. Frank thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment: his inheritance of the mansion, the discovery of Cornelius's hidden collection, the revelation of the Heritage Preservation Society's ongoing mission. You did the right thing, Sarah said quietly. Cornelius would be proud. Frank looked up at his great-uncle's portrait above the fireplace, those familiar gray eyes seeming to hold approval and encouragement. I hope so. There were moments when I wasn't sure whose side I was supposed to be on. You were on the side of justice, Sarah replied. That's what Cornelius spent his life working for, and it's what you helped accomplish. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Thomas Steinberg. Congratulations on successful operation. Phoenix team requests meeting to discuss future collaboration with Heritage Preservation Society. Your leadership has earned our respect and trust. The message was followed by another from Dr. Vasquez. FBI has invited Heritage Preservation Society to serve as official consultants on international art recovery cases. This partnership could revolutionize how stolen cultural artifacts are returned to families. Would you be willing to coordinate our participation? Frank showed the messages to Sarah, who smiled with genuine happiness. It sounds like your new career is just beginning. 6 months after the Van der Berk raid, Frank stood in the mansion's restored conservatory, adjusting his tie and trying to calm the nervousness that had been building all morning. Through the tall windows, he could see guests arriving for what Sarah had insisted on calling the most important social event Millbrook has seen in decades. The Ashford Heritage Foundation was hosting its first annual gala, bringing together FBI officials, museum directors, Holocaust survivors, and families whose stolen artwork had been recovered through the Heritage Preservation Society's efforts. But more importantly for Frank's personal anxiety, it was also his wedding day. Sarah appeared in the doorway, radiant in a simple cream-colored dress that complemented the autumn light streaming through the conservatory windows. She'd insisted they keep the ceremony small and intimate, focusing on the people who had become their extended family through the heritage recovery work. Having second thoughts? She asked, though her smile suggested she wasn't seriously worried. Frank took her hands, marveling at how natural the gesture felt after months of growing closer through their shared mission. Only about whether I deserve this much happiness. That's exactly why you deserve it, Sarah replied. Because you still question whether you're worthy of good things happening to you. The ceremony was conducted by Mayor Richardson, who had transformed from skeptical opponent to enthusiastic supporter as Frank's work with the Heritage Preservation Society brought positive attention to Millbrook. Pete served as Frank's best man, wearing the same suit he'd worn to his own wedding 40 years earlier, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Thomas Steinberg, now 104 and still sharp as ever, had traveled from Boston to attend. During the reception, he pulled Frank aside for a private conversation. Cornelius would have been proud of what you've accomplished, Steinberg said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of friendship with Frank's great-uncle. Not just the successful operations, but the way you've brought the Heritage Preservation Society into the light. We spent so many years hiding our work, wondering if anyone would understand why it mattered. Frank looked around the reception, noting the mixture of FBI agents, museum professionals, and family members whose lives had been touched by heritage recovery efforts. I think people understand now. They just needed to see that the work was being done with official oversight and legal authority. Dr. Vasquez and Dr. Morrison approached, carrying champagne glasses and expressions of satisfaction that Frank had learned to associate with successful case closures. The Rosenberg manuscript collection will be returned to the family next month, Dr. Vasquez reported. 3 generations of descendants will finally have access to their ancestors' writings about pre-war Jewish intellectual life in Berlin. Frank felt the familiar warmth of accomplishment that came with each successful repatriation. What's the timeline for the Meyer sculptures? The Holocaust Museum in Washington wants to display them for 6 months before returning them to the family, Morrison replied. Educational programming about the importance of cultural preservation during times of persecution. Agent Martinez approached their group, carrying official-looking documents that Frank recognized as case files. Even at his wedding reception, work continued. The international cooperation we've developed is producing remarkable results, she reported. We've got active investigations in 12 countries now, all coordinated through the Heritage Preservation Society's research. The network of stolen art trafficking that we uncovered through Van der Berg keeps expanding. Frank examined the documents, noting cases in France, Germany, Austria, and Poland countries where Holocaust survivors and their descendants were finally recovering cultural treasures that had been missing for 8 decades. As the reception continued, Frank found himself in conversation with Ruth Bernstein, the elderly granddaughter whose family's Picasso had been among the first pieces recovered from Van der Berg's collection. She had traveled from New York specifically to attend the wedding and express her gratitude in person. Mr. Delaney, she said, I want you to know that getting our painting back changed more than just our family circumstances. It gave us closure on a grief we've been carrying for 70 years. Knowing that someone cared enough to never stop looking, that made all the difference. These conversations continued throughout the evening, each one reinforcing Frank's understanding of why Cornelius had devoted his life to heritage preservation. It wasn't just about objects, it was about connections, about maintaining links between past and present, about ensuring that the stories of ordinary people weren't lost to history. As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Frank and Sarah found themselves alone in the mansion's library. The room where Frank had first discovered Cornelius's journal now served as the headquarters for the Ashford Heritage Foundation, its walls aligned with files documenting ongoing recovery cases around the world. Sarah sat in the leather chair behind Cornelius's desk, their desk now, while Frank stood before the portrait of his great-uncle. The painting had been professionally restored, and Cornelius's gray eyes seemed more alive than ever, holding approval and encouragement for the work being carried on in his name. Do you think he knew? Sarah asked quietly. When he wrote that letter to his unknown heir, do you think he knew it would all turn out like this? Frank considered the question. I think he hoped. I think he saw something in the family connection, some potential that I couldn't see in myself at the time. Sarah joined him before the portrait, slipping her arm around his waist. He saw what I see. Someone who understands the value of things that seem broken but are worth saving. Frank looked around the library, taking in the changes that had transformed it from a dusty repository of secrets into a vibrant center of ongoing work. Files were organized in modern cabinets. Computer equipment connected them to researchers around the world, and photographs of recovered artwork covered one wall, a visual reminder of their mission's success. But the room's essential character remained unchanged. It was still a place where important work was done, where justice was planned and implemented, where the threads connecting families to their heritage were carefully preserved and rewoven. What do you think comes next? Sarah asked. Frank picked up a folder from the desk, a new case involving artwork stolen from a museum in Prague during the Nazi occupation. The pieces had surfaced at auction houses in 3 different countries. and the Heritage Preservation Society had been asked to coordinate an international recovery effort. More of the same, Frank said. More families waiting for closure, more treasures waiting to come home. Sarah smiled. I can't think of better work to spend our lives doing. Later that night, after the last guests had departed and the caterers had cleaned up, Frank walked through the mansion that had become his home. Every room held memories of the past 6 months, the library where he discovered Cornelius's secrets, the conservatory where federal agents had planned recovery operations, the dining room where Heritage Preservation Society members had strategized their approach to challenging cases. But the room that meant the most to him was the small study on the second floor that he'd converted into a private office. The walls were covered with photographs and letters from families whose stolen heritage had been recovered, visual reminders of why the work mattered and who benefited from their efforts. In the center of the room sat a simple wooden desk. And on that desk was a framed photograph taken earlier that evening. It showed Frank and Sarah cutting their wedding cake, surrounded by the extended family they built through their heritage recovery work. FBI agents, museum professionals, Holocaust survivors, genealogical researchers, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by the return of treasures they thought were lost forever. Frank studied the photograph, marveling at the journey that had brought him to this moment. 9 months ago, he'd been invisible, worthless, a man who took up space without contributing anything of value. Now, he was the coordinator of an international network dedicated to cultural heritage preservation, married to a woman who understood his mission and supported his work, living in a mansion that served as headquarters for operations affecting families around the world. The transformation seemed impossible, but Frank had learned that impossible things happened when the right person met the right opportunity at the right moment. Cornelius had seen that potential in him, had trusted him with responsibilities that seemed far beyond his capabilities, had believed that redemption was possible, even for someone who had lost everything. Frank picked up a pen and began writing his evening report, a daily summary of heritage preservation society activities that was distributed to law enforcement agencies and partner organizations around the world. It was routine administrative work, but it connected him to a global mission that gave meaning to every day. As he wrote, Frank thought about the future. There were hundreds of cases still pending, thousands of families still searching for stolen heritage, countless treasures still hidden in private collections around the world. The work would continue for decades, probably generations, but Frank was no longer worried about whether he was worthy of the responsibility. He had learned that worthiness wasn't something you possessed. It was something you earned through daily choices, through treating important work with the respect it deserved, through never forgetting that behind every recovered treasure was a family whose story mattered. 6 months after the Vanderberg raid, Frank stood in the mansion's restored conservatory, adjusting his tie and trying to calm the nervousness that had been building all morning. Through the tall windows, he could see guests arriving for what Sarah had insisted on calling the most important social event Millbrook has seen in decades. The Ashford Heritage Foundation was hosting its first annual gala, bringing together FBI officials, museum directors, Holocaust survivors, and families whose stolen artwork had been recovered through the Heritage Preservation Society's efforts. But more importantly for Frank's personal anxiety, it was also his wedding day. Sarah appeared in the doorway, radiant in a simple cream-colored dress that complemented the autumn light streaming through the conservatory windows. She'd insisted they keep the ceremony small and intimate, focusing on the people who had become their extended family through the heritage recovery work. Having second thoughts? She asked, though her smile suggested she wasn't seriously worried. Frank took her hands, marveling at how natural the gesture felt after months of growing closer through their shared mission. Only about whether I deserve this much happiness. That's exactly why you deserve it, Sarah replied. because you still question whether you're worthy of good things happening to you. The ceremony was conducted by Mayor Richardson, who had transformed from skeptical opponent to enthusiastic supporter. As Frank's work with the Heritage Preservation Society brought positive attention to Millbrook, Pete served as Frank's best man, wearing the same suit he'd worn to his own wedding 40 years earlier, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Thomas Steinberg, now 104 and still sharp as ever, had traveled from Boston to attend. During the reception, he pulled Frank aside for a private conversation. "Cornelius would have been proud of what you've accomplished," Steinberg said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of friendship with Frank's great-uncle. "Not just the successful operations, but the way you've brought the Heritage Preservation Society into the light. We spent so many years hiding our work, wondering if anyone would understand why it mattered." Frank looked around the reception, noting the mixture of FBI agents, museum professionals, and family members whose lives had been touched by heritage recovery efforts. "I think people understand now. They just needed to see that the work was being done with official oversight and legal authority." Dr. Vasquez and Dr. Morrison approached, carrying champagne glasses and expressions of satisfaction that Frank had learned to associate with successful case closures. "The Rosenberg manuscript collection will be returned to the family next month," Dr. Vasquez reported. 3 generations of descendants will finally have access to their ancestors' writings about pre-war Jewish intellectual life in Berlin. Frank felt the familiar warmth of accomplishment that came with each successful repatriation. "What's the timeline for the Meyer sculptures?" "The Holocaust Museum in Washington wants to display them for 6 months before returning them to the family," Morrison replied. "Educational programming about the importance of cultural preservation during times of persecution." Agent Martinez approached their group, carrying official-looking documents that Frank recognized as case files. Even at his wedding reception, work continued. "The international cooperation we've developed is producing remarkable results," she reported. "We've got active investigations in 12 countries now, all coordinated through the Heritage Preservation Society's research. The network of stolen art trafficking that we uncovered through Van der Berg keeps expanding." Frank examined the documents, noting cases in France, Germany, Austria, and Poland, countries where Holocaust survivors and their descendants were finally recovering cultural treasures that had been missing for 8 decades. As the reception continued, Frank found himself in conversation with Ruth Bernstein, the elderly granddaughter whose family's Picasso had been among the first pieces recovered from Van der Berg's collection. She had traveled from New York specifically to attend the wedding and express her gratitude in person. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "I want you to know that getting our painting back changed more than just our family circumstances. It gave us closure on a grief we'd been carrying for 70 years. Knowing that someone cared enough to never stop looking, that made all the difference." These conversations continued throughout the evening, each one reinforcing Frank's understanding of why Cornelius had devoted his life to heritage preservation. It wasn't just about objects, it was about connections, about maintaining links between past and present, about ensuring that the stories of ordinary people weren't lost to history. As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Frank and Sarah found themselves alone in the mansion's library, the room where Frank had first discovered Cornelius's journal. Now served as the headquarters for the Ashford Heritage Foundation, its walls lined with files documenting ongoing recovery cases around the world. Sarah sat in the leather chair behind Cornelius's desk, their desk now, while Frank stood before the portrait of his great-uncle. The painting had been professionally restored, and Cornelius's gray eyes seemed more alive than ever, holding approval and encouragement for the work being carried on in his name. "Do you think he knew?" Sarah asked quietly. "When he wrote that letter to his unknown heir, do you think he knew it would all turn out like this?" Frank considered the question. "I think he hoped. I think he saw something in the family connection. some potential that I couldn't see in myself at the time. Sarah joined him before the portrait, slipping her arm around his waist. He saw what I see. Someone who understands the value of things that seem broken but are worth saving. Frank looked around the library, taking in the changes that had transformed it from a dusty repository of secrets into a vibrant center of ongoing work. Files were organized in modern cabinets. Computer equipment connected them to researchers around the world, and photographs of recovered artwork covered one wall, a visual reminder of their mission's success. "What do you think comes next, Sarah?" asked. Frank picked up a folder from the desk, a new case involving artwork stolen from a museum in Prague during the Nazi occupation. The pieces had surfaced at auction houses in 3 different countries, and the Heritage Preservation Society had been asked to coordinate an international recovery effort. "More of the same," Frank said. "More families waiting for closure, more treasures waiting to come home." Sarah smiled. "I can't think of better work to spend our lives doing." Later that night, after the last guest had departed, Frank walked through the mansion that had become his home. Every room held memories of the past 6 months. The library where he discovered Cornelius's secrets. The conservatory where federal agents had planned recovery operations. The dining room where Heritage Preservation Society members had strategized approaches to challenging cases. In his private study on the 2nd floor, Frank sat at his desk surrounded by photographs and letters from families whose stolen heritage had been recovered. A framed photograph from the wedding showed him and Sarah surrounded by their extended family, FBI agents, museum professionals, Holocaust survivors, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by the return of treasures they thought were lost forever. Frank picked up his pen and began writing his evening report, a daily summary distributed to law enforcement agencies and partner organizations worldwide. It was routine administrative work, but it connected him to a global mission that gave meaning to every day. As he wrote, Frank thought about the future. There were hundreds of cases still pending, thousands of families still searching for stolen heritage, countless treasures still hidden in private collections around the world. The work would continue for decades, probably generations, but Frank was no longer worried about whether he was worthy of the responsibility. He had learned that worthiness wasn't something you possessed. It was something you earned through daily choices, through treating important work with respect, through never forgetting that behind every recovered treasure was a family whose story mattered. Frank Delaney had spent 9 years believing he was nothing. Now he understood that everyone was something, that every person carried the potential for redemption and purpose, that even the most broken lives could be rebuilt into something beautiful and meaningful. The mansion settled around him as night deepened, but Frank felt more awake and alert than he had in years. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new families to help, new treasures to recover. It was work that would never be finished, but work that mattered more than anything he'd ever done. Frank looked up at the small portrait of Cornelius that hung above his desk. His great-uncle's gray eyes seemed to hold infinite patience and encouragement, as if Cornelius had always known that this moment would come, that the work would continue, that the mission he'd devoted his life to would find worthy successors. Frank nodded to the portrait, accepting both the inheritance and the responsibility it represented. He was no longer just Frank Delaney, homeless man who'd inherited more than he could handle. He was Frank Delaney, guardian of cultural heritage, protector of family stories, keeper of treasures that connected people to their past and gave them hope for their future. It was more than enough reason to get up tomorrow and keep working. It was more than enough reason to believe that the man everyone had forgotten had finally found something worth remembering.